Good evening, everyone. I'm Billy Marie Lubiano Robinson. I have been talking with a lot of you in the chat and paying attention to every week's class, so I'm really excited, but also nervous. Please don't judge this too hard, but super excited to share our family story. I personally work in tech as a developer for nonprofits, local businesses, and other social impact organizations. Tonight, I just wanted to share a bit about our family's food garden. We actually live in a residential home in the suburbs of Los Angeles, where food gardens, food forests, they're very hard to come by. Our front yard is essentially the outlier in the entire neighborhood, as you can imagine. Everyone walking by slows down to stare, to look, to ask questions. It's usually well intentioned, but sometimes, critical. The soil that we inherited from this property was nowhere near the level of health when we first moved here. A lot of the homes in our neighborhood, unsurprisingly, in America, right, consisted of dried lawns, gravel, succulents, lots and lots of just unkept landscapes. To close it all out for the intro, my mother, she's actually a master gardener, and she worked for years to transform the soil and cultivate what's now known as our family's food forest. Along the way, my brother and I helped with irrigation, planting, harvesting, composting, and rainwater collection. But I do want to make it very clear, my mother is the architect of our family's food forest. And of course, while we aren't 100% sustained by this garden alone, we do eat fresh veggies, fruits, and herbs from the garden all year round. We have a bit of a wild methodology when it comes to cultivating. So we've got guava, dragon fruit, grapefruit, kale, amaranth, lettuce, grapes, succulents, exactly one Japanese maple, which I don't know how it's thriving, but it is, roses, wisteria, basil, mint, persimmon, taro, oranges, passion fruit, avocado, which it's been 10 years and the avocado still hasn't fruited. We suspect the squirrels or the wind. Plumeria, eggplant, bell peppers, tomatoes, orchids, and much, much more. One of our family friends actually planted a hot pepper, which I did not know yesterday. I had assumed it was a dwarf sweet bell pepper. Took a bite of that, and it was just not very fun. But that's the spirit that we try to cultivate our land in. On to land evaluation. I covered a bit about what grows here, so here are some notes on the land itself. The plant hardiness zone is 9B. As I mentioned, we're in Los Angeles, and as we're in the Valley of LA, we experience extreme heat, as you know, wildfires, and extreme seasons of wind, which usually pick up October. The soil map results are 101, which is Anacapa urban complex land, and that goes from 0 to 2% slopes. I also pulled a nearby soil map result, which is more in tune with how the soil was when we, again, purchased the property, which was 116 graviota sandy loam, 9% to 30% slopes. The average rainfall here is less than 15 inches, so not a lot of water. And finally, we reside on Kizh territory. This is also known as Tongva to some people. The natives of this area during Spanish colonialization were actually enslaved and forced to construct church missions. Kizh is just a word that refers to the houses that they lived on, which it translates to the people of the willow brush houses. For our resource inventory, we have a long lineage of family farming in our background. Our known family history stems from tropical jungle farming in the Visayan Islands of the Philippines. We also have generations of experience from our lineage in West Africa, as well as enslavement in the southern region of the US. When it comes to water, since we live in an area that's known for wildfires and drought, we harvest rainwater, recycle a lot of gray water, so used water from the sink, from baths, etc. And we also use, of course, the city's water. We also recycle food waste through composting, along with cuttings, as you can see in the middle picture, I count bees and butterflies as regular contributors. They're usually around in the garden. It's a good sign when they are, and of course birds too. As you might be able to tell from the pictures, we follow a lot of natural farming practices. That's essentially our methodology. I guess I can stop here to see if there's any questions before moving on to the next part of the presentation.
I don't see any in the chat panel, just
Okay. All
some
right, moving
excitement
on.
about what you're doing.
Oh, how awesome. That's great. So our farm family mission, we are guided by a steadfast and spiritual belief in the community's ability to heal land degradation through ancestral reforestation practices. Uh, Personally, I'm interested in the connection between traumatized land and modern agricultural practices. As the planet continues to heat up, I really honestly believe that increasing land access and encouraging the cultivation of food, family and community food gardens is the right path. That means empowering everyday individuals who maybe aren't farmers and maybe don't have immediate access to land. That means encouraging all people on the planet to be stewards and caretakers for this land. My hope in taking this class and learning more about farming in this method, I really hope to rekindle this type of love of land for future generations like my daughter, as well as generations to come. Our major goal is to start a nonprofit farm that is dedicated to healing degraded land through the cultivation of food forests. I'd love to hear any ideas you have for connecting with resources, people, groups, government programs, and networks, anything that can help us achieve this goal. From where we stand, we are literally just a random house in a random neighborhood who decided to do this. We have gotten a lot of excitement from neighbors. Things we're still trying to figure out little things like how do we sell food if we're just a residential property with this backyard garden, right? We're in the stages of trying to figure out how to further this mission, and anything you can think of to help with that would be a huge, huge plus. And then I think as a side note for another major goal in the coming years, we're looking to finance a purchase of degraded land exactly for this purpose, which is sort of taking that unused and untreated land and cultivating a food forest on it. If you have any tips on how to approach something as massive as that from a conservation and environmentalist framework, I would greatly appreciate it. I think in closing, I just have my contact info, which as you can see, we don't have a website, we don't have anything. It's just literally my email and my LinkedIn profile. If you would love to get in touch, I would love to keep in touch with everybody here. It's been an awesome experience learning from everyone. The presentations, Erica as well, and of course my other classmates who ask interesting things in the chat. I'd love to stay connected. I think we're at the time now, so I'm going to turn it back to our major goal and stop here. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you so much, Billy Marie. There are a couple of questions for you. Jessica was wondering, how much land are you actually working with?
That's a great question. We're on about 0.2 acres, and I would actually say 0.1 because obviously the house takes up the other part of that. So maybe 0.15, something like that.
And then Air was wondering about using gray water. Do you have to filter it to get soap and other residue out?
That's a great question. So I don't know the particulars, and again, we're coming from this as complete amateurs, but in our experience, soap actually is very good for getting rid of a lot of the pests at the surface. So we leave the soap in there. I did create sort of a rain barrel system where there's a filter inside of a rain barrel. I drilled a hole at the very bottom and tubed it out so that way gravity just kind of gets a lot of the mesh and filters into the water. But it's a very, again, amateur filtering system. I'd love any expertise anyone has in that area, I'd love to hear thoughts on if that's a good practice or not.
Great. And then one more question. Have you or does anyone you know use human biological waste for composting?
Oh, that's a great question. So I actually know people who did. We personally don't. I'm interested in that, but the rest of my family is absolutely not interested in it. But I did live on a small bit of property in Sweden for a residency where we did utilize human waste for composting. It was essentially just utilizing a lot of sawdust, shoveling, and digging. That was the system. So it wasn't an in-depth system, but we did plant the human compost.
I wanted to just share with you that my neighbor on our farm, he moved here from Holyoke, Massachusetts, where he lived in a duplex with his friend Eric Tonesmeyer, and they did what you've described here, obviously in a much different climate, much colder, more humid climate. But they turned I think theirs was a 1/10 of an acre backyard, and they wrote a book about the process
Oh,
called
wow.
Paradise Lot.
Oh, that's great. Paradise
And
lot.
they turned it into a really amazing food forest, but they haven't taken it that step further of what you're describing here. So I don't have any particular advice about that. Let's see. Sorry, there were just another couple of questions, and then we should probably move on to Meg's presentation. Do you have any smaller goals like system improvements or aspirations for new additions? Liam is wondering.
Oh, that's a great question, Liam. Yes. Ideally, we would like to make, I'm trying to figure out how to show this. We have a bit of a slope, as you can see, and it's fencing to our neighbor's property on that right hand side picture. We would love to figure out a better use of the land, especially considering it's sloped and it's so small. I mean, it's really small. And of course, that's our rainwater system right there. So right now, all we do is we bucket the rainwater and water it that way. I personally am very interested in experimental do-it-yourself irrigation methods that utilize rainwater and gray water. So I'm trying to figure out, and again, I'd love to connect with anybody who's interested in this kind of thing, ways to connect the barrels to a slope when you can't channel the water downhill. What are ways to do that in a sustainable manner that aren't expensive and don't involve expensive pumps? That's one aspect that I'm really interested in.
I wanted to make sure too, I should have mentioned this again earlier, that all of you have noticed in Teachable at the very end of the week 4 resources, there's a forum where I encouraged people to add their contact info. I know a lot of you already have, but as far as staying in touch with each other after this course and being able to share ideas, we have promised that we won't share people's contact info without their consent. And so I thought that having people enter their contact info in that forum might be the best way, even though it doesn't gather it all up into like a nice spreadsheet or anything for you all. One final question, Billy Marie, was just about your relationship. A few people mentioned permaculture, and I wondered if you wanted to mention if you have any particular like interest in or training in, or sort of what you're really, I know you're aware of permaculture, but what your feelings are on that.
That's a great question. So my personal feelings, because we have a historical context of how our families have tended to the land, I see permaculture as a great methodology, as a great academic source of knowledge, and a great way to get people involved. But I personally do not enjoy the practice of taking knowledge, which has been cultivated for centuries, and then certifying it. I personally am just not a fan of that. So again, personally, I think it's a brilliant practice in what the spirit is and the methodology, but I personally, again, do not subscribe to that framework specifically because it seems very it can be in some ways very capitalistic and very elitist when I really am interested in how do we share this knowledge without gatekeeping it, without rebranding it, without repackaging it as something new and trendy, because that's always going to happen. Something newer is going to come, something trendier is going to happen. So I personally am not uh, certified, but I respect and admire those who take the path because any sort of land caretaking to me is a good thing.
That was beautifully said. Thank you again so much, Billy Marie. And there's a bunch more questions for you to check out in the chat panel, questions and
Thanks,
comments.
everyone. Oh, great. Thanks, everyone, for having me. And thanks again, Erica.